All right. Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Angela Natoli of the Chiropractic and Functional Neurology Center. Today, I am lucky enough to be with Ginny Porter. Good morning, Ginny.
Good morning.
So Ginny is going to help us get along with our significant others and help our mental health during this quarantine, which what is better to talk about? So let me introduce Ginny. Ginny is the founder and sole practitioner at Collaborative Growth Counseling near Pittsburgh. She's trained as a clinical social worker with an undergraduate degree in psychology and a master's degree in social work. Ginny has been in the mental health field for 15 years and has additional training in both couples therapy and family therapy. She's now primarily employs her skills to do adult individual psychotherapy as well as family therapy and couples counseling. So what better to talk about than when we're all under lockdown with our significant others?
Right. Yeah.
So are you seeing a lot of increased stress among patients right now?
I am. I mean, I think that anything that comes with the unknown and anything that feels uncontrollable for people obviously is a trigger for anxiety in general. Add on to that the inability to go toward the coping skills that we normally use. And it's kind of the recipe, right, for having increased anxiety and depression and tensions in the home. So
Absolutely. So what coping skills would people normally head towards when they're not under this quarantine, I guess we could say?
yeah. Well, so I think first, let me just kind of do the caveat of in no way, shape, or form am I a bigger expert in COVID-19 than anyone else. But I think the one thing that I do kind of know how to handle and navigate through is the mental health world. And I know that this has a direct impact on that. So
Absolutely.
normally, obviously, one of the things that we always tell people, and one of the things that I actually think is really possible for people if they try really hard to model even in the quarantine times is we often go to looking for like a couple coping skills that work, and a lot of that time you of all people and I'm sure that a lot of your patients know the mind body connection is a huge thing.
Absolutely.
So people would go to the gym, people would go to their chiropractor on a regular basis, people would do all of these things to kind of be in a better place and in a better mindset, and now some of that has been taken away to a certain extent.
Yes.
And I think that just creates a lot of anxiety because you stay in the idea of like, well, now I can't do what worked for me. I can't do what decreased my own anxiety and my own thoughts that are in my own head. So almost feeling trapped there. But I think at the same time, if you think about what quarantine does, is it forces you to say, what skills do I really have? So I think on an individual side, the one thing that I've definitely seen is with all of the conversation around the pandemic, it's this idea of constant information.
Mhm.
And I think most people know to limit that if it's really anxiety producing. But I think the other thing that hasn't really been talked a lot about is both with individuals and with couples is these unfair comparisons, right? So it's the unfair comparison of, my gosh, I see this person online that I think has it all together, even in midst of the quarantine, that I don't feel that way. And
Mhm.
so I think that's this added development for people where they stay in their own heads and just think, why don't I feel that way, or why am I not doing better? So I think that all of those things, when we take away people's ability to go out and socially connect, to go out and do things that make them feel better physically, even if it's something as little as going and get your hair done, going and get your nails done, like doing things that just make you feel better. Obviously, I think that we have to figure out how to translate that into the walls of our home.
Absolutely. And then one of the things we were talking about with someone I interviewed yesterday was the difference between social distancing and physical distancing. So we don't have to socially distance ourselves from
Yeah.
others. We have ways to still stay social, but not be in physical contact with people.
Absolutely. And I think for the mental health side of that, I think part of that comes down to routine. You know, I think that if you can develop a routine where on a regular basis you have a session like this with one of your
Yeah.
friends, or you have a regular phone call, or you play a random game with people, there's a lot of ways to kind of go into that social engagement. And I think that that's a really, I mean, I think it's an incredible point of view to consider when you're taken away from that physical portion. you can definitely still maintain what has worked for you.
Yeah.
That doesn't have to mean that you have to. If you weren't incredibly social before, if that's not what helped you through, it's not like that has to be replaced and you have to stress about it. But I think it's being incredibly aware of what your routine was prior to.
Right. So I think one of the things on everybody's minds right now are they're in their homes, they're in much closer contact with people that they would normally spend the whole days apart and see them at night. So their spouses, their kids, now everybody's under one roof all day, morning, day, and night. And it's a very different routine to get used to for a lot of people. So what are some of your suggestions on how to handle that in a healthy manner and not, have spouses start turning on each other like, Jack Nicholson in The Shining, let's
Yeah.
keep people out of jail, right? If you think
Yeah.
you're doing bad in quarantine, jail's going to be worse.
So I think that part of that also depends your starting point, right? If you were already in like a really tense position within the couple's world, obviously that's going to feel different. And I think it's incredibly important to be aware of that. But ironically, I think with families and on the kids' side, there's been a ton of information about do this with your kids, keep your kids on this routine, do a lot of this, like do a lot of that. And people are really good about knowing, okay, I'm going to lose my mind if I don't have stuff planned for my kids.
Yeah.
But on the couples side, I actually think one of the things that we know about connection with couples and to feel like you have more of that healthy intimacy between each other, part of that is anticipation. And when you take away being out of the house, when you take away leaving for a day and coming back, you lose a part of that into like anticipation of, oh, what did they do today? What happened with this? What happened with that? You take out the outside world.
Yeah.
So I think in some ways, thinking about schedule as a whole family and as a couple is also super important. So the one thing I would say is don't hesitate to schedule in your day and in your week time where you're like, yeah, I'm not going to spend this time with you. Like, I like you, but I've watched your face so much that I need a little bit of time away. And I think having that time where you also know, I'm going to take time for me and you're going to take time for you. And we can respect that to build up a level of that anticipation of, okay, well, now I want to come together and watch a movie because we haven't been sitting on the couch, both trying to work, both trying to expect the other person to know what we're thinking all the time. Mm-hmm. So I think that schedule is huge for couples. Another major thing that I would actually say is using the time to consider where your connection is on that base level. So one of the gurus of all things couples are the Gottmans, and they're this couple that do everything out in Seattle. Not a great place to be right now, right? But they actually do a lot of research on, at a base level, they have a thing called a love map, which is really just kind of a clinical idea for how well do you know your partner at their base. And they have a lot of really cool ideas and tools behind that to be able to say, okay, instead of just sitting there being, how was your day? Good. How was your day? Which right now it's like, you watched me have my whole day.
You were there, sir.
Yeah, you were there the whole time. It kind of replaces that with questions that maybe you don't know. So do you know who your partner's best friend was in third grade? Mm-hmm. Probably haven't had a reason to necessarily have that conversation, and maybe you have, but they have lists of questions. So you can Google Gottman Love Maps, you can go to their site and look at it. But the idea behind it is actually using this time in a very intentional way, so that when you guys come together, outside of scheduling time apart, actually scheduling some time to work at the base on conversation that doesn't just feel like
day to day.
Okay, like I don't have anything else to say to you because we've been in this house for a month type thing.
I love it. So then what are your recommendations on how to separate business from social life, from family life right now during this time?
Yeah, so I think one of the big things is to consider intentional goal setting in each of those areas. If you think about, everybody should have goals in regular life. So even if we weren't in quarantine, you should have a goal that you're working toward. And I think now that we are in this space, I think setting intentional goals together, even as a couple, to be able to say, okay, is there anything we really want to do to be able to talk through, goals as a family. Is there something we want to do with this time? Goals with your business, with your partner's business. Is there something that either of you are sitting there saying, hey, I never have the time to do this 12-hour training, so I really want to be able to have that. So not only intentionally goal setting with yourself, but discussing it with your partner, discussing it with your family, and being able to say, hey, these are things that this is not ideal for anyone, but maybe this is something that we can really prioritize, and we can meet certain goals that both of us have, so that we're not always in contradiction to each other's goals, but rather super aware. So that way, if you say, okay, I'm going to work on this training, I'm going to sit down on Wednesday from this time to this time. Does that work with your schedule?
Mm-hmm.
It's a clear separation, and you would have to do that if you were physically going somewhere to meet some of the goals. Part of that would be a natural discussion, because it would be a have to. We're just going to take the have to into the want to, so that you function better as a household.
Yeah, and I think that's fantastic. And I think a lot of this too is really seeing the silver lining within what we're being given right now. There's a lot of positives to this. People are always saying, if I had more time, I would do X, Y, Z. If I had more time with my family, I would do whatever. So I think part of it is just utilizing that time that we're actually being given kind of a gift right now, and kind of a bad situation, but there's some positives to it.
Yeah.
And I think that's important to refocus the brain and see it as an opportunity to get things done. Maybe look at that to-do list that you haven't tackled in a year, and see what you can get done right now, and just see what you can do with your kids, or see what you can do with your spouse, like you're saying, and just utilize the time more efficiently, rather than kind of sulking around the house and being angry that you're stuck there. So
yeah. And I think the other important thing to note is, if you're in a really bad place going into quarantine, I also think it's important to remember that there is help, even though you may be not in the best mindset because you're in this house and you're feeling like really claustrophobic to it. But if you're sitting there saying, hey, listen, I don't have the space to work on that base, because I just feel like now we're incredibly aware of the problems, and that's all we're focusing on. I think even that, it's important to remember, this did not take away supports in our world. We're incredibly lucky that we have technology and that we have resources that we do. So I think it's incredibly possible, if you need it, to be able to say, okay, what we're going to do during this time is we're going to reach out to a therapist that does telehealth, and we're going to start couples counseling because you travel, or we're never together, and we need to figure out how to communicate better, because communication is obviously key for a family to not go into that place. And I think with communication, there's a part of that can get to the point where you can feel a lot of contempt or resentment being at home, and so the other thing I would consider, just on that side of it with couples, would be being aware in conversation what your request is. So instead of going to a point, if you start to have major conflict, if you start to fight, getting to a point of, number one, knowing it's okay to separate, always. But I think if it is a fight that is just like a normal issue where you're like, I can't talk about this anymore, and you need to take a break, whoever walks away is then given the responsibility of reinitiating the conversation. So if you walk away because you need a break, you then at some point, once everyone calms down, can come back and identify either, hey, I don't think that we can talk about this together, or can we go back to that? And any conversation worth having, especially in quarantine, has to come with a reasonable request at the end of it. So instead of you never help, change that to, if you could just not push your dish in the sink and put it in the dishwasher, I would be forever grateful, right? Not that you're groveling or asking your partner to do something that they should be doing, but it's about communicating in a way that has reasonable requests, so that you're not breeding more of that contempt in a time frame where we should instead be building more of that, like, very aware of building a culture of appreciation.
So I think that's an awesome piece of advice there on how to rephrase our questions or our requests, basically. So what are the main things that people are running into right now? It's obviously going to probably be cleaning the home, or, probably watching kids, or splitting duties around the house, right? I would assume that's the main thing that you hear right now.
Yeah. Yeah, so part of what makes families work is having clear expectation and having really clear roles, right? So when all of the sudden your role is to be, okay, if I'm always in charge of the home and my husband is always doing stuff outside of the home, let's say they're working more or whatever it may be, and suddenly we're both in the home all the time. And
Hmm.
suddenly something that I did every day, he's like, well, why are we doing it that way? That
Hmm.
can feel like a very big attack. So I think that obviously I'm seeing that a lot, is just the idea of this complete shift in roles where everybody is now home and there's not this clarity of, okay, well, you do this thing and I do that thing. And it's not bad that people want to be more involved in their home, obviously.
Yeah.
But I think that that falls into the next big problem I'm seeing, which is really just that communication piece, the communication of how in the midst of being together 24/7, and no one's going to be perfect. So also realize, admit when you're human. So there's going to be times where you speak to your partner or your kids or anybody in a way that is not what you're going to want to post on Facebook, right?
Okay.
But I think admitting that you're human and afterwards kind of saying like, hey, I'm navigating this world too. And I know I shouldn't have talked to you that way, but I am so stressed. And then being able to say, like, this is when you do this, I feel this way. So instead of feeling like you have to go to that defensive position, actually giving yourself a way to say, hey, I want you to understand I feel this way, but it's not coming out of nowhere. So I think that's something I'm seeing a ton of. And then I think just the walls closing in on us, right? And feeling like the unknown. And I think that's the scary thing about this virus is, I mean, I hear from a lot of people the idea of like, I don't know what a week from now, a month from now, what if I get sick? What if people I love I get sick? And I think that people are really stuck in those what ifs.
Yeah.
And I think all you really can do is focus on what you can control, doing all of the recommendations that are put out by the healthcare professionals who are at the forefront of this virus. And then I think going back to also being aware of that mind body connection, because I think that's the other thing that's taken a really big hit in this. People aren't out, even being able to like go and window shop if you need to be out for a little bit or whatever. The mind body connection is huge on taking breaks, being able to know it. And I think you could probably even speak to that more than I could, to that point in regards to that connection of being aware of your physical sense of being.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point as well. So you mentioned that the anxiety, obviously, of the unknown, and now the virus of possibly getting sick, of possibly, how long are we going to have to be in this house? How long are we going to be out of work? Anxiety is shooting through the roof for everybody, and like you said, everybody's human. We're all in it together.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the way you change that is your response to it, right? We can't change the circumstance. We can only change our response. So what are some of your um, tips on how to lower the anxiety at this point for people trying to deal with it? Maybe they have an anxiety disorder. Maybe it's just anxiety that they're feeling over this current situation.
Yeah.
What would you offer to them?
So I think that there are a couple specific things. And actually, I had sent you two links that I think that they'll probably be able to get after the talk. But the CDC and NAMI really have come up with a lot of different things. They're constantly changing their resources.
Mhm.
So I'll go over a couple base level things, but there's also really good resources if you're feeling your anxiety is from something specific. If you're worried about finances, if you're worried about something else, there's a lot of resources out there to be able to say, hey, that part might be unique to you. And the one thing I would say is with that anxiety, I think that's a really good question. Is this part of the worry or this part of the anxiety unique to me? If it is, then I think you can look at it and say, okay, like how can I control that or what can I do about it? So if it's not, if you're sitting there saying, no, this anxiety feels like what everyone is feeling. This feels like it's probably relatively normal, but it is not fun. Then I think you can go to that space of being able to say, okay, can I limit my intake, right? So being able to limit it, but also communicating with the people in your support group, in your support system, what's making you anxious. I think sometimes people go a lot into what they've heard about the virus, but they're
Yeah.
not going into, hey, this is what I'm nervous about, or this is what's making me super anxious.
Yeah.
And I think that having something that can be more meaningful to you so that someone can look at you and say, yeah, I get it. me too. Or being able to look at you and say, wow, I didn't think about that. And validating some of those concerns can be really good. And just talking about it, we know, is a double-edged sword, right? Talking about it is really good. Obsessing over it and making that your whole day, all day, every day is not good. So, and I think the other coping skill kind of portion of it is trying to implement other things in your life. So even if you didn't exercise regularly, exercise is a really interesting thing within mental health. And it can be going out, just getting outside for a walk, doing something different. There are a ton of different online platforms that have put out free resources because we're all home now.
Yes.
And the research in regards to exercise and mental health has kind of shown it's a really hard thing to actually research in a way to get substantial results. But the one thing that they have found pretty consistently over time, and even in analysis of all of the research that had occurred, is that exercise as a platform to handle anxiety and depression is that there's clinically meaningful improvement, right? So we don't know the significance of it, but we do know that if you start exercising now, maybe that won't help with your overall anxiety right now. Maybe it will. Some people it does, some people it doesn't. But if you put that into part of your pattern, what we do know is that when life restarts, which is going to be a second wave of anxiety, when life restarts, if you continue some of those patterns, there has been some clinically meaningful evidence to show that exercise and the mind-body connection can decrease your chance of having a relapse of the significant anxiety you may be feeling now. So I think right now, coping with that, it's limiting information, talking to the people around you, trying to still be socially connected, which you had already talked about. And I think you had said somebody else had talked even more about that piece of it. So I think that there are a lot of really good base level things. You just have to be aware of it and really work hard to put it in place, because it's easier just to sit on the couch with the news on.
Yeah, and right now, I mean, get your news from credible sources, right? Go to the CDC website, do things like that. Maybe don't get all your news from Facebook, and everything's getting, blown out of proportion when it comes to social media. Not everything, but a lot of things are. And if you're an anxious person or someone who's dealing with that normally, that may not be the platform for you to get your information, because you may not be able to filter out, oh, that looks like it's media driven, or it looks like it's actually scientifically driven.
Right.
So being able to filter those things out, do you have any advice on how to filter that out, or do you think just avoiding it is the better option?
I think you could put time limits on anything. So even on Facebook, I believe even itself now has a time limit to it that you can actually limit. Whether it's on Facebook, you can download a separate app that limits your time for some of this stuff. But because I think that's the other part of it. If you are on even, let's say, Facebook as your news, right?
Yeah.
And I'm saying this as you're going to post this on Facebook, which is ironic, right?
but this is good news.
Yeah, there you go. But I think that even that part of it, it's staying connected to people, staying connected to news, doing all of those things. There's a limit to all of that.
Yes.
If you do too much of that, it gets to a point where you're just going to go down the rabbit hole of unfairly comparing yourself to those 3 people who are taking an hour to get the perfect picture and being like, it's so crazy. We're perfect as a family. And my husband and I have never been more connected. And my kids are perfect. And they now speak fluent Japanese, and they didn't even speak a word of Japanese before this. Like, you're going to go to that place of having this very unfair comparison, and it's not going to do you any favors. So I think limiting anything that is not a very specific news source, but then also deciding, think about considering 1 or 2 professional news outlets that you say, I agree with that, that input, that information. I think it's a reliable source. And then also identify just a couple people that are going to be your support people to talk about that specifically. Yeah. So it's not that in every social engagement, you're starting with, tell me everything you know about COVID. Like, at that point, you're allowing yourself to cycle in a way that is not going to get you to a place where you can think about any of the other stuff we talked about. If you're allowing it to consume you, you're not going to intentionally goal set. You're not going to spend time working on the base of your relationship. You're not going to work on changing how you deal in conflict, because you're going to be so tense about this one subject that it's going to take up all the oxygen in the room, and there's not going to be room for anything else.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more, Ginny. I think that's fabulous. So are you doing telehealth right now with
I
patients? Are
am.
you taking new patients?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have that much space for new patients, but I always tell people if they need help and they don't know where to start, I am always happy to be a resource, and I'm always happy to kind of help them navigate the world, because I think that can be really overwhelming for people too, especially in the mental health world. There's a really big need, and there's a lot of really good therapists, but sometimes there's just not enough resources out there for
Right.
people. So if it's intimidating and they feel like, I don't know how to start this, I think even that part of it, I completely understand. So even if it's not, and I always, the one thing that I think in regards to therapy that people think is that if I'm a good therapist for one person, then I'm a good therapist for all people. But therapy is a very intimate relationship. So
Yeah.
I think being able to also know if you're ready to start that journey, you may decide hearing me talk for 10 minutes that you're like, nope, could not listen to that woman talk every week for an hour or whatever it may be.
I would say
And
that about you, Ginny.
but I think being able to go over that conversation of what is the best fit for me, who do I feel connected to, and if you're feeling really overwhelmed in the process, just know that there are people to reach out to. So I think for me individually, I don't have a ton of space, and I think, but if somebody wants to reach out to me and say, hey, can you just help me get started, or can you talk me through like this first part of it, I'm always happy to be a resource in that regard.
That's wonderful. So you did send me a bunch of resources, and I'm going to put all of that in the comments underneath this video. Do you have anything else that you'd like to add before we end our session today?
I think just have everybody know that everybody just is doing their best little by little, and don't judge yourself too hard during this time. This too shall pass, and that there will be this wave of anxiety. There will be another wave of anxiety when they tell us like, hey, go ahead, go out into the real world. But if we take things a day at a time and we make sure that we have ourselves in times where a lot of things feel out of control, I think that's the best way to be able to be in a better place when we're on the other side of this.
So maybe when we're heading back towards part 2 of this saga, we'll do another meet and greet with everyone and give them advice on how to navigate through that piece of it too. So
sure.
all
And
right,
I'll be learning about it with you all. So
we're just taking it day by
something
day.
that I talked about was helpful for somebody, but also just know in no way, shape, or form am I saying that something I'm saying is contradictory. If you have a therapist of your own, or if you're going through something that works for you, it is not a one-stop shop. So we're talking in generalities, and I hope it's helpful for people to be able to know, hey, where do I even start in this? But also know if you need help beyond just the general information, the help is out there.
Absolutely. And I think that's the reason I started doing this series anyway, is to bring healthcare professionals out to people in their homes. People feel stuck right now, but we're here. And that's something that I tell all of my patients and anyone that's following us right now on these videos is we're still here. We're still able to take phone calls. We're still able to, I mean, right now I'm still open. We're still considered essential, but you're still here, you know, like you and everyone out there has connections. We may be physically apart right now, but there's definitely resources out there and a lot of healthcare professionals willing and ready to help at any given time. So don't feel so stuck, essentially.
Yeah, I think it's great that you're doing this. I think it's a really awesome way for your clients to know that it's not just that you care about them when they're in the office, but you care about them across the board. So
We do.
not that they didn't already know that about you.
Ginny, thank you so much for chatting with us today and helping our followers that are listening to us today navigate through this tough time with our quarantine with our spouses. And hopefully we'll do this another time when the second wave of anxiety, hopefully it doesn't come, but
yeah,
the part 2 of this, when that comes, we'll be able to talk again and offer more advice at that time. So
absolutely. Thanks for having me.
no problem. Everyone, you have a wonderful day. And as usual, if you need us, give us a call at the office. We're here, 330-647-7373. Have a wonderful day, everyone.